Shall we get started?
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Garrett Martin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Center for Economic Policy. For 25 years, MESEP has provided rigorous, credible analysis and research about our state's economy. MESEP is a member of the Prosperity Coalition because our state has a unique opportunity right now to build an economy that works for all of us. It can do so by unrigging our tax code and investing in Mainers. Despite some positive top-line trends in our economy, it's still too hard for working Mainers to make ends meet. The cost of living is rising. We have low unemployment, but many Mainers are underemployed or are barely able to hang on to a tenuous job. And while there's evidence of wage growth, nearly half of Mainers report that they can't afford a $400 emergency expense, like a broken down car or a sudden illness or injury. There are several causes for these contradictions in the data, but two are crucial. First, income and wealth inequality in Maine are growing. As the price of living increases, low and moderate income Mainers are being squeezed while the wealthiest prosper. Second, the things that create economic security and growth, things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and reliable public services, have been underfunded and undermined for years. Tax policy connects these two problems. Over the last decade, Governor LePage advanced lopsided tax cuts that made it harder for our state to invest in people and communities. The resulting decrease in revenue brought predictable results. Our schools were underfunded, vital public services were slashed, childhood hunger and poverty increased, bucking regional trends. This legislature has inherited Governor LePage's rigged tax code and the funding challenges it creates. They've inherited the fact that the poorest Mainers pay more of every dollar they earn in taxes than the top 1%. They've inherited the fact that our next budget is missing $864 million because of LePage-era tax breaks that funnel most of that money to the wealthiest. They've inherited these problems, but they have the power to solve them. Tax and budget policy are not laws of nature. They're not encoded in our state's DNA. Tax and budget policies are the result of choices made by people. This year, we can choose to keep Governor LePage's tax breaks and all the waste they create, or we can ask everyone to pay their fair share so we can invest in our communities and build a stronger, more secure economy for all Mainers. By rolling back the wasteful tax breaks of the previous administration, we can tackle economic inequality by investing in the foundations of opportunity. We can fully fund our public schools for the first time since voters demanded the state pay 55% of the cost of education. Amen. We can strengthen local services and infrastructure to improve Mainers' quality of life. We can invest in health care and good jobs so families can thrive. The Prosperity Coalition represents a broad and diverse group of Mainers, some of whom are here. We are policy experts and students. We are immigrants and state employees. We are union members and small business owners. We are teachers, clergy members, grassroots activists, and local elected officials. Together, all of us are calling on the legislature and the governor to leverage the state budget to build a stronger, more inclusive economy that works for all Mainers, not just the wealthiest. Thank you.
My name is Crystal Ward. I am a retired Lewiston High School teacher, and I am the legislative chairperson for the 5,500 members of the Maine Education Association retired. Tax cuts made during the LePage administration tilted our tax code in favor of the wealthiest while doing real harm to our public education system. Mainers have voted 3 times to invest in our public schools, including in 2016 when they voted not only to fund our schools but to raise taxes on the wealthiest Mainers to pay for it. Schools still do not receive the 55% voted by the people. Instead, budget after budget has underfunded our schools, and often tax cuts to the wealthy are given, leaving educators and local communities to make do with less. Educators across the state have had to dip into their own pockets to buy classroom supplies. Towns and cities have to cut services, while property taxpayers are asked to pay more and more to make up for the income tax cuts for the wealthy. But it's not just today's educators who have paid the price. It's also retired educators across our state. The tax cuts were paid for in part by the cuts to the Maine public employee pension system. Hardworking public servants shouldn't have to get less just so the wealthiest could have their tax cut. The never-ending cost shifting was nothing but a flim-flam to make it look like the cost at the state level was going down and that we were all saving lots of money. But the big reality was when you send the cost back to the locals to pay the state's bills, the people lose, our schools lose, local services lose, and property taxes skyrocket. When the state chooses tax cuts for the wealthy over funding for schools and retired educators' pensions, they are voting to either cut services for the schools, roads, fire, police, plowing, or raising property taxes. All the time telling us over and over again that they are helping us. Honestly, I do not want that kind of help. It is time to stand up for the hardworking people of Maine, not just the wealthy people of Maine. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Andrew Brogdon. I'm a career firefighter paramedic for the town of Orono and a member of the Professional Firefighters of Maine. I live with my wife and 4 children in Old Town, and I have watched firsthand the damage created over the past decade due to revenue sharing cuts and the effects it has had on public safety of our communities. Orono is the second largest municipality in Penobscot County for population and is also home to the University of Maine flagship campus. The normal population in Orono is just over 10,000. It surges to over 20,000 during the school year. The town of Orono has been forced to increase taxes because of the loss of revenue sharing. The town is reducing public programs and cutting employee benefits. Orono's property taxes have gone up substantially since revenue sharing was cut. Because of the lack of revenue sharing, the town of Orono, with a regular population, is one of the highest mill rates in the state. Because the state has reduced the share of revenue to towns, the need for our work has not decreased. In fact, it has increased. We have the same staffing level we have had since 1999, but our call volume has increased significantly in this period of time. We need more staff, but we are told there's no more money. Fire departments across Maine are in the same situation. I hear it from my fellow firefighters every day. Cutting funding desperately needed for first responders in order to give tax cuts to the wealthy is wrong. We need a budget that prioritizes tax fairness and will work to get the resources we need in the communities where we live and work every day. We can no longer jeopardize public safety to give handouts to the wealthiest 1% of Mainers. Firefighters strongly support increasing revenue sharing back to 5%, as this will help towns grow. Taxpayers will have a relief on the pressure of increasing taxes, and towns will be able to offer fuller services that everyone needs and deserves. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mark Brunton. I'm a member of the Maine State Employees Association, SEIU Local 1989. After a decade of underfunded and understaffed public services in Maine, barely a week goes by without Mainers hearing about the lack of resources impacting the public services they count on. The members of my union go to work every day determined to do their best to serve Maine people. Yet they are frustrated, disappointed, and outraged to see solvable problems fester and worsen over the years. Our public health nursing program was dismantled during a crippling opioid epidemic. Our 911 call centers and our child and adult protective services are understaffed and overwhelmed. A recruitment and retention crisis jeopardizes the delivery of quality public services in all departments of Maine state government. These are just a few examples. There are lots more. Everyone in state government has sacrificed over the last 10 years. We've endured furlough days and a state shutdown. We've seen dramatically increased costs to our health insurance and cuts to our retirement. We've fallen further behind compared to private and public sector compensation and benefits. If we're going to right the ship, system-wide solutions are needed. The crisis in the delivery of public services is directly related to tax cuts enacted during the past 10 years. Those tax cuts will cost our state $864 million in the next budget, with the most of the benefit going to the wealthiest households. Maine's elected leaders could have chosen to spend that money to fund public services, our education system, and other investments that build a stronger economy for working people. Instead, Maine's elected leaders spent that money on tax cuts for those at the top. Budget writers this year have real choices to make. Should the next state budget continue the status quo for another 2 years, with public services undermined by a lack of resources? We say no. Or should the next state budget address our recruitment and retention crises and adequately fund the staff and public services Mainers rely on? We say yes. Should the next state budget continue to underfund our schools and our communities for another 2 years, just so the wealthiest can keep their tax cuts? We say no. Or should we unrig our tax code so everyone pays their fair share, so we can invest in Maine people in our economy? To that we say yes. It's time for Maine to take action to end the many crises in public services. It's time for Maine to stop underfunding revenue sharing and state aid for education. It's time for Maine to address the revenue crisis it has created over the past 10 years. That's why over 13,000 Maine workers and retirees we represent are going to fight to make sure we right that ship. Thank you.
My name is Cheryl Golick and I live in Harpswell. I am speaking to you today because of two experiences I've had. I come from generational poverty. I have lived more than half my life in poverty. I am also one of the founders of a small business that provides long-term dementia care at the Vicarage by the Sea. I am fortunate to be where I am today because Maine's public services and benefits made a difference in my future. I am here today because I have hope for the future where Maine asks everyone to pay their fair share and invest in people, systems, and services we all need but cannot create or accomplish alone. Today, our tax system privileges those at the top at the expense of the rest of us. I am part of the Prosperity Coalition because I know it doesn't have to be that way. I have been paying into the system since I was 12. I worked and scraped together a living at every low-wage job you can imagine. And at 52, I've just gotten to the point now where I can save a little. We ought to do more for the people I know who are working harder than ever. Many are working 2 or 3 jobs, but still can't make ends meet. At the same time, corporations with hefty profit margins and the wealthiest among us get tax breaks and incentives while paying poverty wages that force people to rely on public benefits to survive. This lopsided system hurts us all, but it causes the most pain at the bottom for the poor people. Our local towns and communities are struggling to make budgets to fill gaps, to address the poverty and hardship that is too common in our state. The old trickle-down system we were sold hasn't worked, and most of us who grew up poor are still waiting for opportunities we were promised a long time ago. Just think what we could do if we made a commitment to each other and if everyone paid their fair share. We could support the health and well-being of our neighbors, make health and dental care affordable for all, and offer education and training so many families can make. in a changing economy. We need a budget to invest in immigrants, newcomers, and all the potential they bring. A budget that commits to reliable public services that provide communities and families a strong foundation. We can do this. When we invest in people, whether that's a low-income single mom like I was, or a new immigrant trying to build a better life in our state, we not only lift up individuals, we also strengthen our economy and communities. As a small business person who is constantly searching for employees, I know that Maine needs to welcome new workers and fresh ideas, and we have to support people in their journey to become rooted, stable, and healthy residents of the state we all love. Paying into the system can lift us all up, but not if those at the top aren't paying their fair share. That's not how our state budget math works. That's not how our society should function. Everyone should be willing to pay into that system in a fair and equitable way. Let's grow the pie instead of fighting over the crumbs. We need systematic level investments and tax fairness in Maine. We all want our kids to grow up better than we had it. We know what we need. We need to invest in each other, to trust each other, and to generate strong public services that lift people up. Please join me in supporting the principles of shared prosperity here in Maine. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Pius Ali. I am a city councillor in Portland, Maine. I am joining the Prosperity Coalition to add my voice to say enough is enough, and to encourage our state legislators to do the right thing for our state. Over the past decade, the LePage administration's tax cuts primarily benefited the wealthy. It robbed the state of resources necessary to invest in our communities, our economy, our schools, and our future. Today, we have a real opportunity to unreal our tax code and secure the public resources we need to invest in our towns, cities, and to invest in our towns and cities that are facing many challenges with homelessness, public transportation, and education. We have an aging workforce, which is why it is important to invest in adult education across the state to support language acquisition and work readiness program for immigrants and other marginalized members of our communities. They are truly the future workforce of the state. We can pay for what is needed to help families and communities to prosper if we repeal the LePage-era tax cuts for the wealthiest. This year, the income tax cut passed under Governor Paul LePage will cost our state $432 million. More than half of that benefit of the cut will go to the wealthiest Mainers. If we fix our tax code and stop wasting money on tax cuts that enrich only lucky few, we'll have more than enough money to fund our schools, provide high-quality local services, and make other forward-looking investments in our future. Continued funding cuts that put students, families, and communities further behind aren't inevitable. Lawmakers have a choice. They can continue funding wasteful tax cuts for the wealthiest, or they can fix our tax code and put that money to work for Mainers and our economy. In November, voters elected candidates who endorse a people-powered approach to our economy. One that prioritizes good schools, healthcare, job training, and infrastructure. Those elected officials can deliver on their promises, but only if they get to address the revenue challenges created by years of Governor Paul LePage's lopsided tax cuts. Fixing our tax codes will give lawmakers the tools they need to turn their big ideas into real solutions for Mainers. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all our speakers and both you all. So if there are any questions, certainly happy to answer them, and if there are particular speakers you want to address them to, we can make that happen too.
I'll ask a general question. How much do you want to raise taxes? And would this just be on a certain income group, or what's the specific that you're asking for?
Well, I think, Don, the answer to that question is two parts. One is we know that there are commitments that have been made around wanting to fund revenue sharing, wanting to fund our schools, and other things such as fully funding adult education. So from that, we can arrive at a number. That's certainly reflected in the prosperity budget that the Maine Center for Economic Policy produced earlier this year. But the reality, the real answer to your question, though, is there are some people who may actually see their taxes go down under these scenarios. The fact remains that our tax code is out of balance, and that if we unrig it, if we assure that people at the top are paying their fair share, that corporations that are profitable are paying their fair share, we can create a better balance throughout the code, so that some people now who are seeing their property taxes go up as a consequence of underfunding for revenue sharing in schools might actually get some relief. So it's not as clear as a black and white of raising taxes and
But you're very specifically calling for an increase in income taxes on certain income tax payers, right?
Sure. Part of the prosperity budget plan calls for rolling back some of the tax cuts that were provided under the LePage administration, and that would result in tax increases on wealthier Mainers. But that said, there are a number of other proposals currently before the legislature for expanding taxes on lodging, for instance, and finding ways to export taxes to people who are non-residents. Again, rebalancing the tax code by assuring that those at the top are paying their fair share, making sure that corporations that are sheltering money offshore are held accountable for those profits and paying taxes as they should on those. So the point being, in the same way that we make a lot of choices in terms of how we spend the money, we have a lot of choices available to us in how we can raise the money. And we just want to encourage the current legislature and the governor to at least have a real and practical conversation about how we can do that, and how we can do that in a way that is in the best interest of all Mainers, not just a few Mainers, and that can create both balance and opportunities for prosperity for our communities and people in the state.
Are there any bills in the legislature right now that as a coalition you're going to be lobbying for?
I don't have a good answer to that question. I think that part of what we're doing as a coalition is we're waiting to see how the budget process unfolds. There are certainly some individual bills that I know different members of the coalition have identified as bills that we support, but I can't speak for the coalition as a whole. This is really sort of a kickoff of sorts for that effort, where we've all come around together and said, we share the view and the desire to see these kinds of outcomes. We don't exactly know what that pathway looks like right now, but we look forward to working with the legislature and the governor's office to encourage them and help them assess their options and find the best path forward that represents sort of the interests and values that folks have addressed in their remarks.
Garrett, a paraphrase from the governor's office. Just a couple days ago, we were talking to her communications director, and he said, in effect, the governor has no interest in raising taxes in this 2-year budget. So, how do you get around that?
Well,
I mean, it's pretty firm.
Sure. And I think there are very few elected officials who are willing to come out swinging on taxes. We have seen a few around the country who do, and actually have done so to good effect. Our view is that in this state we have the opportunity to have a more productive conversation around the need for revenue and how we might raise revenue that's good for our state and makes sense. And so, that is an ongoing conversation that we look forward to having not only with the governor, but with the legislature writ large. What you know as well as anybody from covering these things, there are a lot of times when people say things are off the table and then lo and behold, they wind up back on the table. I'm not going to pretend to have a crystal ball or suggest that the governor is going to somehow change her position. But I do think that at the end of the day, the budget process is a process that involves not only the governor's office, but also the legislature. And in that conversation, we hope to inject some ideas that we think can result in better outcomes for all Mainers. And again, reflect other promises that have been made by those same elected officials to assure that we are funding revenue sharing and local services, to assure that we're funding education. So at some level, we can't, the question I would throw back at you, Scott, is, which item are we going to press on in terms of which promises are we going to uphold and expect our lawmakers to uphold, and which ones do we give them a free pass on?
Yeah, I asked the questions around here.
That's a fair statement. Sometimes I answer them.
So I'll try again.
Sure.
There you go.
I get two very different questions. Back to the wealthy. Obviously, the question, whatever number it was on raising school funding a couple of years ago,
Sure.
Had a very specific threshold above which it wanted to increase the taxes. Do you also have one in mind?
I think, Don, I would be inclined to actually refer you to Sarah Austin to talk about with her, maybe not right at this moment, but talk about the various options that we have been looking at. Again, as I said earlier, I can speak for the Maine Center for Economic Policy and some of the solutions that we have been looking at, but those may or may not necessarily be entirely endorsed by the coalition per se. I do think that part of the solution definitely involves looking at those LePage-era tax cuts and raising taxes at the top end of the income ladder, and rolling some of those back. So,
And I think you and a couple of the speakers mentioned that those tax cuts have, by cutting those taxes, the budget has $864 million less coming in than would have.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that all of that, that's over 2 years, I believe.
Sure.
All of that needs to be restored in
Well,
this budget?
the analysis that we've done has shown that, in truth, you don't have to roll back all $864 million to fully fund revenue sharing, to fully fund our schools, to fully fund other priorities that people have expressed. And again, while rolling back certain portions of the LePage tax cut, there are other sources of revenue that we think might be better than a full-scale rollback of some of those cuts. Because let's admit that there were some changes that were made for low and moderate income folks that we would want to keep. Improvements to the property tax fairness credit, for instance, improvements to the earned income tax credit. Those are programs that we know make a difference in the lives of low and moderate income people, and we actually feel that we can increase those in this budget conversation. So it's both a combination of rolling back some of those tax cuts, identifying new sources of revenue, and making sure, again, that we're attaining balance in our code so that the people at the bottom of the income ladder aren't paying more in taxes as a share of their income relative to what people at the top of the income ladder are paying, which is the way it is right now.
Don, I'll say if you want to see some specifics about policies at Maine Center for Economic Policy Sports, I can send you dozens of pages of research analysis. But are there any other general questions about the coalition? Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.